Little over 2 months have gone by since I posted my first and only video analysis entitled Lebanon and the Middle East. What happened since? How accurate or inaccurate were my predictions? What's next? More importantly, why am I rushing this video without much preparation, like the previous one? Mainly because I believe that a major conflict will occur in the next few days or weeks, and I won't have enough time to produce detailed information with a detailed video before a conflict occurs. The conflict will happen unless we see a major concession or concessions from Iran or from the upcoming US administration regarding Iran. Either options would be hard to expect at this time, therefore prompting this serious conflict, not to call it an outright war. First, I would like to thank over 31,000 people from 29 different countries who viewed my first video. The response was overwhelming, and I'm grateful for the support. The horrifying explosion of August 4th in Beirut prompted me to develop and share my thoughts and analysis with you back in September. A lot has happened since, in Lebanon and around the world. And, as I said earlier, I expect much more serious events to happen in the very near future, thus prompting me to recap and update my thoughts. Let's do a quick recap of the September analysis. The premise of the whole presentation was based on a series of events or actions starting back in 2012, and some even earlier, that led to the explosion in Beirut, as well as multiple events that have occurred after the explosion, and will continue to happen to achieve specific objectives. That none of these events are coincidental, and each one is part of a much bigger plan. It is important to note that in my original analysis, I never mentioned the role Turkey had and is currently playing in the region and its impact on the future of the Middle East. A rather negative impact that I ignored at the time, mainly due to the sizable amount of research required to produce the video. I will continue to ignore it this time, knowing that it will be covered by multiple sources with much better details than I ever can. This in no way is minimizing Turkey's role. Quite the opposite. It is too important in the region, and I cannot give it the importance it deserves. Simply put, Turkey's actions to muscle itself in the region are reminiscent of the old Turkey, the Ottoman Turkey, flexing its muscle through its proxies, as recently as seen in Armenia, where horrific history was repeating itself, as well as Turkey's involvement in northern Syria and northern Lebanon, all in an effort to claim a piece of the pie regarding oil, gas, and trade routes to Europe, whether through the Mediterranean or through railroads and pipelines. Claiming itself once again as the Sunni Muslim leadership in the region. An obvious affront to Saudi Arabia. I'll leave it at that and get back to the recap. If you're interested in the actual conclusions of the previous analysis, in an effort to avoid the very boring first 40 minutes of the video, something I would fully understand and support, I suggest you review the last 7 minutes, starting at minute 39:50, to get a brief idea of the analysis, its predictions, and its conclusions. A quick recap. In early September, that analysis assumed additional sanctions in the coming days. Some did happen, including the ones imposed on the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and son-in-law of the President, with much more to come to unexpected figures of the Lebanese political establishment. I also mentioned new peace agreements between Israel and other Arab nations, namely Bahrain and Sudan, following the UAE peace agreement. They happened as well, and we should expect more peace agreements in the region. A rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia was also expected, and sure enough, Netanyahu flew to Saudi Arabia a few days ago for the first time ever to meet with MBS. The overarching idea in the analysis was that the US and the Western world will put so much pressure on Hezbollah and Iran, cornering them into submission by all means necessary. The problem is that these actions were also crippling Lebanon economically in unprecedented ways, much worse for the people than anything they've experienced in the past, worse than the 15-year civil war they experienced in the 70s and 80s. So far, the pressure seems to only impact the people, with Hezbollah and its allies showing no willingness to spare the people from misery. No initiatives of reforms, no serious signs of cooperation, except maybe their pseudo-approval for a Lebanese delegation to negotiate the maritime borders with Israel, in preparation for oil and gas exploration, something I also discussed in my analysis as the main driver for most current conflicts. Lebanon's inflation is currently the second worst in the world. The Lebanese currency was devalued by over 300% in a few months, with much more to come. The West showing no interest in providing any financial relief as long as Hezbollah overwhelmingly controls the government. Soon enough, the pressure will start impacting Hezbollah directly, as well as their official and unofficial allies. Any person or party that played a role in legitimizing Hezbollah will be a target for sanctions. Also expected and discussed in the analysis. It is clear, however, that my conclusions were far too optimistic. Where I thought that the extremely corrupt, feudal, and religiously driven political class in Lebanon had an ounce of dignity and a tiny bit of caring for the people. Turns out I was wrong, and Lebanon's governing class is willing to burn the country and its people before making any compromises. That they would sacrifice an entire nation with all its rich culture and rich history to remain in power. The ship is sinking, and in this case, the captain, the first mate, and the entire crew are not willing to save any passengers. Only the few who can make it to a lifeboat will leave, draining the nation's brain resources even further. So what's next? What is this critical conflict that I'm predicting? And why? If you follow international politics, in my analysis, you know that the Trump administration adopted a very unusual foreign policy in general, and more specifically in the Middle East. Nothing the administration did was conventional, at least to foreign affairs experts and diplomats. Trump employed unprecedented methods that yielded positive results in most cases, unexpectedly. Most pundits, opponents, or experts would never admit it, including myself, but most would have loved to claim such victories for themselves. I will spare you biased politics, and I will stick to the Middle East, where peace agreements were signed with Israel for the first time in over 26 years. While these agreements were being negotiated and many more on the way, the US was implementing multiple steps to deal a final blow to Iran and all its proxies, forcing a more realistic, peaceful, and balanced Middle East while ensuring the protection of Israel. Clearly, the Trump administration advanced a very aggressive regional agenda that most people would consider unrealistic. To further corner Iran, have Israel sign peace agreements with most Arab nations, redraw or confirm all the trade routes in the region, impacting Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Control or ensure that allies control regional oil and gas explorations. Many things happened with Pompeo racking up miles traveling to the Middle East, not the least of which are the official negotiations between Lebanon and Israel for the maritime border sponsored by the United States without serious opposition from Hezbollah, the unofficial ruler of Lebanon. So let's be realistic here. Do you really think that Donald Trump will leave office without making sure that his foreign policy in the region continues as planned? Do you really think that Benjamin Netanyahu will take the risk of going back to the same policies of appeasement with Iran, with a toothless Iran nuclear deal with the whole West? Do you really think that Arab countries, Saudi Arabia included, will allow such changes to happen? For the first time ever, the US, Israel, and the vast majority of Arab countries are on the same side against Iran, and they will not risk the possibility of a 180-degree turn in American foreign policy. Especially after President-elect Biden reiterated a few days ago his commitment to reinstating the Iran nuclear deal, giving Israel, the Trump administration, and the Arabs a serious sense of emergency. The only way to stop the incoming Biden administration from overturning its predecessor's policy is to put the US in a position of no return. A conflict that will force the US to choose between Iran and Israel. An obvious choice any American president will make. So how would you put the incoming administration in this position if you are Israel, Saudi Arabia, or Donald Trump? It's very easy. Create a conflict so severe, well prepared, and so obvious to the American people and the Western world that no one would question their allegiance. I believe that a major conflict will happen in the next few days or weeks, involving attacks on Iran and possibly its proxies. This attack can be started by the US, but most probably will be started by Israel, drawing the US into the conflict. It is clear that over the past few weeks, Israel has taken so many actions covertly in Iran, in Syria, and in Lebanon, trying to prompt or ignite a conflict, something Iran and Israel have been avoiding for months, awaiting the new administration. I don't believe that Israel and its newfound allies in the region will wait much longer, and an attack is imminent. Some important developments on the ground show preparations underway. Here are a few bullet points. A large B-52 bomber landed in the UAE, depositing heavy loads of military armaments and serious bombing firepower. Keep in mind that the UAE are literally across the Gulf from Iran. Another group of B-52 bombers now deployed in military bases in the vicinity of the Indian Ocean, east of Iran. Second, the redeployment of the Sixth Fleet from the China Sea to the Indian Ocean. Then, the preparation of an airport at the US base in Erbil in Iraq, 70 miles from the Iranian border. Then drones and fighter jets flying over the Gulf, Syria, and Lebanon have not stopped for a few days, mostly by the Israeli military, with some US military involvement. We also know from unconfirmed sources that the Azerbaijan government agreed to allow the Israeli military to use its airspace, in conjunction with Turkey. We also know that American diplomats in the region, in some Middle Eastern countries, are quietly leaving, including Canadian and European delegations, in anticipation of a conflict. An unexpected quick deal between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, lately both being on opposite sides of the regional conflict, have allowed the Qataris to use Saudi airspace as opposed to Iran's airspace. An unprecedented heavy traffic of political delegations traveling between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. We've also seen recently Israeli aircrafts allowed to use Saudi airspace, technically for commercial use only. We also have unconfirmed reports of British military deployed in Saudi Arabia to protect oil fields and pipelines. We also have serious changes and resignations within the US Department of Defense, way too early prior to an upcoming change in the White House, can only be explained by a major disagreement in policy between the White House and DoD. That would involve the engagement of the US military. We also had a sudden halt of the Israeli-Lebanese maritime border negotiations, for no apparent or substantial reason. Military movements throughout Israel only seen in the past as preparation for war. And, of course, the Iranian assassination of yet another major figure in the Iranian military, following the assassination of their top nuclear scientist, with rumors of plots to assassinate the Hezbollah leader in Lebanon, and rumors that he had already escaped to Iran for protection. Way too much movement and way too many variables to ignore, pointing to the possibility of a major conflict in the region. Going back to my previous analysis, Iran and its proxies did not capitulate or even blink under sanctions and economic hardship. Instead, they chose to bite and delay, hoping the new US administration will come and relieve the pressure. The US and Europe have tried sending messages in various ways to Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, letting them know of their intentions. Some as clear and obvious as French President Macron's visits to Lebanon, hoping to achieve change diplomatically, à la française, only to be snubbed and ignored by Hezbollah and its allies. They showed no intentions of laying down or following the US plan for the region. And I don't believe Netanyahu, Trump, or their regional allies will risk their long-term plans. So they will act quickly, with only a few weeks before the new administration takes over. I hope I'm wrong, and a peaceful solution takes place, but I'm not confident that such an option is still possible. So I believe that a conflict is imminent in the next few days or few weeks. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please subscribe and feel free to comment. Thank you.